The dust of the Nevada highway tasted like grit and regret, a fine red powder that coated everything. It settled on the chrome of Jaxx's Harley, on the cracked leather of his cut, on the grim line of his mouth. He and Rook had been riding for 6 hours, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. The engine's roar the only conversation they needed. They'd pulled into a desolate gas station that looked like it was one bad day away from collapsing into the desert. It was a place for ghosts and gasoline, nothing more. As Rook filled the tanks, Jaxx stretched, his back popping in protest. The world was silent except for the buzzing of flies and the distant shimmer of heat off the asphalt. Then, the silence was shattered. A sound, small and sharp, cut through the oppressive heat. A cry. Jaxx's head snapped up. A boy, no older than 7, was sprinting across the cracked concrete lot, his small legs pumping with a desperation that clawed at something deep inside Jaxx's chest. The boy's face was a mess of tears and dirt, his eyes wide with a terror that was ancient and absolute. He wasn't running from a scraped knee or a lost toy. He was running from the devil. He skidded to a halt right in front of Jaxx's steel-toed boots, his chest heaving. He pointed a trembling finger toward the highway, where a black, soulless-looking pickup truck was pulling a battered, windowless trailer. The truck was accelerating, kicking up a plume of that same red dust. "Help!" The boy sobbed, the word tearing from his throat. "Please! My mom's in that trailer." Jaxx and Rook exchanged a look over the gas pump. A single, loaded glance that conveyed years of shared experience. They'd seen it all. Bar fights, drug deals gone bad, high-speed chases. But this was different. This was a child's plea, raw and unfiltered. Jaxx's instinct, honed by a life on the edge, screamed that this was real. He dropped to one knee, the leather groaning, bringing himself down to the boy's level. The tattoos covering his arms, a roadmap of a hard life, seemed to ripple in the sunlight. His voice, usually a gravelly growl that could quiet a room, was surprisingly gentle. "Hey kid, easy now. What's your name?" The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve. "See Cody," he stammered, his eyes still locked on the disappearing truck. "My mom. He has my mom. Her name's Serena." The name hung in the air. Serena. It sparked something in Rook's memory. He holstered the gas nozzle and pulled out his phone, his thumbs swiping rapidly across the screen. Jaxx kept his focus on Cody, his large hand hovering just above the boy's shoulder, a silent offer of protection. "Who has her, Cody? Who's the man in the truck?" "Gideon," the boy whispered, the name tasting like poison. He said no one would ever find us." Rook let out a low curse. He turned the phone around, and Jaxx's blood ran cold. It was a news alert from 2 days ago. The headline was a punch to the gut. Amber Alert canceled. Mother Serena Hayes and son Cody found safe. The article featured a picture of a smiling woman with warm, kind eyes, Serena. Below it, a statement from a local sheriff's department claimed she had left willingly with her ex-partner, Gideon Croft, after a domestic misunderstanding. It was a lie. A clean, neat, bureaucratic lie that was going to get this woman killed. The terror on her son's face was the truth. Gideon hadn't just taken her. He had manipulated the very system designed to protect her. He had made her invisible. The gas station attendant, a withered man with a face like a dried-up riverbed, was staring at them from behind his greasy window, his expression a mixture of fear and disinterest. He wanted no part of this. Nobody ever did. That was the problem. Jaxx looked from the phone back to the desperate child. The world swam for a second, the desert heat replaced by an icy chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He saw another face, another pair of terrified eyes from a lifetime ago. His sister, Sarah. She'd had that same look, that same hunted expression, the last time he saw her before her husband put her in the ground. Jaxx had been too young, too powerless then. A rage, cold and pure, settled in his soul. Not again. Never again. He looked Cody straight in the eye, and the boy saw something in the biker's gaze that silenced his sobs. It wasn't pity. It was a promise. "We see her, Cody," Jaxx said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "And we hear you. We're going to get your mom back. That's a Hell's Angel's promise." He stood up, the full height of him a mountain of leather and resolve. He jabbed a finger toward the attendant. You, call the state troopers. Tell them you have Cody Hayes. Tell them the boy is safe, but his mother has been abducted by Gideon Croft. Give them my club's number. You don't move from that phone until you hear sirens. The attendant, spurred by the sheer authority in Jax's voice, fumbled for his phone. Rook was already on his bike, the engine exploding to life with a defiant roar that echoed across the empty plains. Jaxx swung a leg over his own machine, the metal hot enough to burn. He gave Cody one last look. Stay strong, little man. We're coming. The two Harleys peeled out of the gas station, tires screaming on the hot asphalt, leaving behind a cloud of red dust and a small boy who had placed his entire world in the hands of two strangers clad in leather. They were angels of a different sort, riding machines of chrome and steel straight toward the gates of hell. The black truck was a speck in the distance, but Jax's eyes were sharper than a hawk's. He could feel the thrum of the chase in his bones, a primal rhythm of predator and prey. But this time, the roles were reversed. Gideon Croft thought he was the hunter. He had no idea what was coming for him. The highway stretched out like a gray ribbon unwound across the desert floor. The heat created mirages, watery illusions that danced on the horizon. But the black pickup truck was no illusion. It was a dark, ugly truth, and it was getting bigger. Jaxx and Rook opened their throttles, and the Harleys surged forward, devouring the miles. They rode in a staggered formation, a two-man phalanx of righteous fury. The wind whipped past them, a hot, dry blast that carried the scent of sagebrush and gasoline. Inside the cramped, stifling trailer, Serena was fighting against the waves of blackness that threatened to pull her under. Her wrists were raw from the zip ties that bound them, and a piece of duct tape was stretched cruelly across her mouth. The air was thick with the smell of rust and despair. Every bump and jostle was a fresh agony, a reminder of her complete powerlessness. Gideon had been so smug when the police let them go. He'd spun a tale of a lover's quarrel, of her being overwrought and emotional. He'd smiled his snake smile, and they had believed him. They had looked at her, at the carefully concealed bruises he'd inflicted, and they had seen nothing. When they stopped for gas, she had enacted her desperate, last-ditch plan. While Gideon was inside paying, she'd used a shard of a broken taillight she'd found on the trailer floor to saw at the tape on her mouth, just enough to whisper to Cody. Run, she'd hissed. Find someone. Anyone. Scream. And he had. He had run like his life depended on it, because it did. Now, all she could do was pray that her brave little boy had found someone who would listen. Through a tiny, grime-caked crack near the floor, she saw a flash of chrome. Then another. A low, rhythmic growl began to permeate the metal walls of her prison, a sound that was deeper and more resonant than the truck's engine. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day. Hope, a feeling so dangerous she'd almost forgotten its existence, flickered her chest. Up in the cab of the truck, Gideon glanced at his rearview mirror. He saw them. Two bikers, riding hard. He sneered. Road trash. Probably looking to cause trouble, or maybe they just liked the look of his truck. He was a man who saw threats everywhere, because he himself was a threat to everyone. He pressed his foot harder on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, and Serena was thrown against the side of the trailer. Gideon's world was built on control, and these bikers were an unwelcome variable. He swerved slightly, trying to force them back, to intimidate them with the sheer size of his vehicle. It was a foolish miscalculation. Jaxx and Rook didn't flinch. They moved with the truck, their bikes like extensions of their own bodies. They were a part of the road, not just on it. Jaxx saw the subtle, aggressive swerve for what it was, a challenge. He glanced at Rook, who gave a slight nod. They knew this dance. Jaxx eased off his throttle slightly, letting the truck pull ahead just enough. Gideon, seeing this in his mirror, felt a surge of arrogant satisfaction. He was winning. He was always winning. Then he saw the turnoff. A dirt road, barely more than a trail, that snaked off into the desolate hills. It was the way to his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude and pain, the place where he could break Serena completely, where no one would ever hear her scream. He wrenched the wheel, and the truck and trailer bounced violently onto the unpaved road. A thick cloud of dust billowed up behind him, obscuring the highway. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He'd lost them. He was safe. He was in control. Miles back, hidden within that same cloud of dust, Jaxx and Rook slowed their bikes to a crawl. They watched the dust settle, saw the tire tracks veering off into the wilderness. Jaxx killed his engine. The sudden silence was profound. "He thinks he lost us," Rook said, pulling off his sunglasses. "He's leading us right to his front door." Jaxx stared down the dirt track, his jaw tight. Let him go back to his hole. We'll find it." They weren't chasing him anymore. They were hunting him. The compound was exactly what Jaxx had expected, a monument to paranoia and cruelty. It was a collection of dilapidated buildings squatting on a few acres of scorched earth, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. A hand-painted "No Trespassing" sign, riddled with bullet holes, was nailed to the gate. It was a place designed to keep people out and to keep people in. Jaxx and Rook had parked their bikes a mile down the dirt road, concealing them in a dense grove of mesquite trees. The sun was bleeding across the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood. They moved on foot, silent and purposeful, the dying light their ally. From a ridge overlooking the property, Jaxx raised a pair of military-grade binoculars to his eyes. The world snapped into sharp focus. He saw the black truck parked near a large, barn-like structure. He saw Gideon, a bull of a man with a cruel, brutish face, drag Serena from the back of the trailer. She stumbled, her legs weak, but her head was held high. Even from this distance, Jaxx could see the fire of defiance in her. Gideon shoved her toward the main building, a ramshackle house with boarded-up windows. "Two dogs," Rook murmured, his own binoculars trained on the property. "Look like Rottweilers. Roaming loose, too. Maybe 3 other guys," Jaxx added, panning across the compound. He saw figures moving in the shadows, men with the same wary, predatory slouch as their leader. This isn't just a domestic situation. This is an operation. A frontal assault would be a death sentence. They were 2 men against at least 4, plus the dogs. They needed backup. They needed the Brotherhood. Jaxx pulled out his satellite phone, a piece of gear reserved for emergencies in places where cell service was a myth. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang once. "Yeah," a gruff voice answered. "Breaker, it's Jaxx," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We got a situation out here. Highway 93, about 60 miles north of Ely." Code Nightingale. There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice, now stripped of all casualness, replied, "How many?" "Target is a woman, Serena Hayes. The one from the news. Her kid is safe. She's held by the ex, Gideon Croft. Hostile compound for maybe 5 armed men, 2 dogs. We need the full chapter. ETA is 3 hours, Prez. Maybe 2.5 if we push it. We'll be waiting," Jaxx said. "Stay dark until you get my signal." He hung up. 3 hours. It felt like an eternity. He and Rook were the tip of the spear. They had to get closer, gather intelligence, find a weakness in the compound's defenses. As dusk deepened into true night, a pair of headlights appeared on the distant highway. A patrol car. Jaxx and Rook flattened themselves against the rocky ground, becoming one with the shadows. The car slowed as it passed the dirt road turnoff, its spotlight sweeping across the desolate landscape before moving on. They held their breath until its taillights vanished. They couldn't trust the law. Not the local law, anyway. Gideon had already proven he could manipulate them. This was on them. All of it. "Time to go to work," Jaxx whispered. They began their slow, methodical descent from the ridge, 2 phantoms moving through the purple twilight, their destination the heart of the enemy's territory. The air grew colder, the scent of sage replaced by the stench of decay and menace that wafted from the compound below. It was the smell of a cage, and they were about to rattle it. Serena was thrown into a dark, musty room. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed wire, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like demons on the water-stained walls. The room smelled of stale beer, sweat, and fear. Gideon shoved her into a hard wooden chair and began securing her to it with thick rope, his movements practiced and efficient. He worked in silence, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. When he was done, he stepped back to admire his work, a smug, possessive look on his face. "You thought that little brat of yours could save you?" he sneered, his voice a low, venomous rasp. "You thought you could outsmart me?" He began to pace in front of her, a caged animal in his own prison of rage. "I told you what would happen if you ever tried to leave me, Serena. I told you, but you didn't listen." He leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "I already took care of the cops. A little misunderstanding. I told them. You were just emotional. They ate it up. As for Cody, he's probably in some state-run hellhole by now, crying for a mommy who abandoned him. You see, you have no one. Only me." Each word was a carefully crafted blow designed to shatter her spirit. He wanted to break her, to erase the person she was and replace her with an object of his control. But as he spoke, something inside Serena hardened. The fear was still there, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but it was being crowded out by a white-hot fury. She thought of Cody's face, of the terror in his eyes as he ran. She had told him to run. She had put that burden on his small shoulders. She would not let his bravery be for nothing. A memory, sharp and painful, flashed through her mind. It was from a month ago. Gideon had come home in a rage, his knuckles already bloody from some unseen fight. He'd cornered her in the kitchen, his shadow swallowing her whole. He grabbed her phone and smashed it against the wall. "No one talks to you but me," he had snarled. "No one looks at you but me. You're mine." That was the moment she knew she had to escape. Not just for herself, but for her son. She couldn't let Cody grow up thinking this was normal, that this was what love looked like. The plan had been forming for weeks, a desperate whisper of a thing. The stop at the gas station had been a chaotic, unexpected opportunity. Gideon had been distracted by an argument with the attendant over the price of fuel. In that split second, she had met Cody's eyes and given him the signal. It was the biggest gamble of her life. Now, tied to this chair in this hellish room, she clung to that gamble. Through the grimy window, she had seen them on the highway. Two riders on motorcycles, sitting tall and proud against the endless sky. At the time, she thought it was a mirage, a trick of the heat in her own desperate mind. But the sound she'd heard, that low, growing thunder, it had felt real. Had they seen Cody? Had they listened? Or was it just another false hope, another mirage in the desert of her despair? Suddenly, the dogs outside, which had been barking intermittently, fell silent. An unnatural quiet settled over the compound. Gideon paused his tirade, his head cocked. One of his thugs, a lanky man with vacant eyes, came into the room. "Boss, dogs are quiet, so?" "They probably treat a raccoon," Gideon grunted, waving him away. But a flicker of unease crossed his face. He was a man who trusted nothing, not even silence. Serena held her breath. The silence wasn't empty. It was watchful. It was waiting. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a sliver of something other than fear. She felt the barest, most fragile glimmer of a storm on the horizon. A storm that was coming for Gideon Croft. The night was their cloak. Jaxx and Rook moved with the fluid grace of predators, their black cuts making them all but invisible in the deep shadows cast by the ramshackle buildings. They reached the perimeter fence, the wire a silver web in the faint starlight. Rook produced a pair of bolt cutters from a pack on his back, and with two sharp, muffled snips, a section of the fence was peeled back. They slipped through the opening and were inside. The two Rottweilers trotted into view, their heads low, a deep growl rumbling in their chests. Jaxx froze, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the large knife strapped to his thigh. But Rook held up a hand, a silent command to wait. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick piece of beef jerky he'd bought at the gas station. He let the scent waft on the night air. He made a low, clicking sound with his tongue, a sound of calm and reassurance. The lead dog hesitated, its growl softening to a wary rumble. Rook took a slow, non-threatening step forward, then another. He knelt down, making himself smaller, and tossed the jerky a few feet in front of the dogs. They sniffed it, then devoured it in seconds. Rook remained still, his hand outstretched, palm down. The lead dog, its initial aggression neutralized by curiosity and a full belly, cautiously approached and licked Rook's hand. "Good boys," Rook whispered, scratching the dog behind its ears. The other dog, seeing its partner's reaction, wagged its tail. The threat was gone. Jaxx watched amazed. "You're a damn dog whisperer," he breathed. Rook just shrugged. "They know we're not the enemy." They continued their silent advance toward the main house, the two dogs now trotting along beside them like old friends. They reached the side of the house and found a grimy window that wasn't boarded up. Peering through the filth-streaked glass, they saw the scene inside. Serena, tied to the chair, Gideon, pacing and ranting, and two other men, armed with pistols tucked into their waistbands, watching with bored amusement. Jax's knuckles turned white as he gripped the window frame. A primal, volcanic rage built in his chest. Every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to crash through the window and end this right now. You want to feel Gideon's bones break under his fists. Rook, sensing the shift in his friend, placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. The pressure was firm, grounding. "Not yet, Prez," Rook murmured into his ear. "Wait for the cavalry. We go in now. She gets caught in the crossfire. We do this clean." Jaxx took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the red haze of fury back down. Rook was right. This wasn't about his rage. It was about her safety. Suddenly, the back door of the house creaked open. One of Gideon's thugs stepped out onto the porch to light a cigarette, not 10 feet from where they were hiding. Jaxx and Rook melted back into the deeper darkness against the wall, their bodies rigid, their breath held. The man stretched, scratched his belly, and took a long drag from his cigarette, the orange tip glowing in the dark. He scanned the yard, his eyes passing right over the patch of shadow where they stood. For a heart-stopping moment, one of the dogs started to trot toward him, but Rook gave a soft, almost inaudible whistle, and the dog returned to his side. The man flicked his cigarette butt into the dirt, yawned, and went back inside, oblivious. Jaxx and Rook let out a slow, controlled exhale. It was too close. They needed a diversion, something to draw the muscle out of the house and leave Gideon isolated. Jaxx looked toward the main gate, then at the two large propane tanks sitting next to one of the sheds. A plan began to form, cold and precise. It was time to raise a little hell. The low, synchronized rumble started as a subtle vibration in the ground, a seismic tremor that grew steadily into the unmistakable sound of a dozen V-twin engines. The cavalry had arrived. They cut their engines a quarter-mile from the compound's turnoff, plunging the desert back into silence. But it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with coiled potential and the promise of violence. Jaxx and Rook slipped back through the fence and met them on the road. The silhouettes of his brothers, astride their silent machines, were a comforting and formidable sight. Stone, the club's vice president, a grizzled man with a face like a granite cliff, dismounted and clasped Jax's forearm. "Report," Stone said, his voice a low growl. Jaxx laid it out quickly and efficiently. The layout of the compound, the number of hostiles, the location of Serena, the presence of the dogs, now neutralized allies, and the propane tanks. A plan was forged in the darkness, a multi-phase strategy spoken in the terse shorthand of men who had ridden into storms together before. "Rattler and Nomad, you're on diversion," Jaxx commanded, pointing to two of the younger, leaner members. "Take the access road around to the north side. There's a generator for the well pump back there. Pop a fuel line. Make it look like it's about to go up in flames. Make a lot of noise. When Gideon's two goons come out to investigate, you fade into the desert." The two bikers nodded, their expressions grim and focused. "Stone, you're with me and Rook on the breach team. We're taking 3 others. We go in the back door the second those 2 clowns are drawn out. The rest of you form a perimeter. No one gets in or out. Croft is mine. The others are yours. Subdue them. We leave them for the state boys. But make sure they know they made a mistake." The men checked their gear. It wasn't an arsenal of firearms. That wasn't their way. It was heavy chains, tire irons, and fists like hammers. Their weapons were intimidation and overwhelming force. "What about the woman?" Stone asked. "Extraction is priority," Jaxx said, his eyes hard as flint. "Rook, you're on her. Get her out the moment we breach. Take her to the van we have parked on the highway. Don't stop for anything." The plan was set. The pieces were in motion. The Brotherhood moved as one, a silent, disciplined unit breaking off into their assigned teams. Jaxx, Rook, and Stone's team circled around to the rear of the compound, taking up positions near the back door. They waited, their patience a weapon in itself. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, on the far side of the compound, a frantic shout echoed through the night, followed by the sound of metal striking metal. "Fire! The damn generator's on fire!" Inside the house, Gideon's two thugs exchanged a nervous glance. "Go check it out, you idiots!" Gideon roared, not even looking up from where he was tormenting Serena. The two men grabbed flashlights and ran out the front door, heading toward the commotion. It was the opening Jaxx had been waiting for. "Now," he whispered. The breach was a symphony of controlled chaos. Stone hit the flimsy back door with his shoulder, and the frame splintered, the door flying open with a deafening crack. They flooded into the house, 5 leather-clad specters of vengeance. Gideon spun around, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. For a split second, he was paralyzed, his brain unable to process the impossible invasion. That second was all they needed. Rook darted past the ensuing chaos, a knife appearing in his hand. He sliced through the ropes binding Serena to the chair with 2 swift, practiced motions. "Come on," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're getting you out of here." Gideon recovered, his shock turning to feral rage. He lunged for a shotgun propped against the wall, but Jaxx was faster. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and delivered a brutal kick to Gideon's side, sending him staggering away from the weapon. "You and what army of clowns?" Gideon snarled, grabbing the chair Serena had just vacated and holding it up like a lion tamer. Jaxx didn't answer. He just smiled a cold, thin smile as Stone and the other 3 bikers filled the doorway behind him, blocking out the light, their massive forms creating an impenetrable wall of leather and muscle. The sneer on Gideon's face dissolved, replaced by the dawning horror of a man who has just realized the trap he thought he'd set for others had just sprung shut on him. "Let's talk about what you did to her," Jaxx said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper as he began to advance. The fight was not a fight. It was a reckoning. While Rook was half carrying, half guiding the trembling but resolute Serena out the back door and into the cool, clean night air, Jaxx and his brothers cornered Gideon. The abuser was strong and fueled by a cornered animal's desperate rage, but he was 1 man against 5. He swung the chair, and Stone caught it, ripping it from his grasp and tossing it aside, as if it were a toy. Gideon threw a punch, and another biker blocked it, his forearm like a steel bar. Jaxx didn't throw a single punch. He just moved, his presence a suffocating force, cutting off Gideon's escape routes, forcing him back into the center of the room. The other bikers dismantled him with methodical, brutal efficiency. A blow to the kidneys doubled him over. A sweeping leg kick took his feet out from under him. He crashed to the floor, the wind knocked out of him. Jaxx stood over him, his shadow falling across Gideon's gasping form. He saw his sister Sarah's bruised face in his mind's eye, heard her terrified sobs. The rage was there, a roaring inferno demanding release. He could end him. Right here, 1 stomp of his steel-toed boot, and it would all be over. But then he thought of Serena. He thought of Cody. Killing Gideon would make him a monster, just a different kind. Justice was what they needed, not just vengeance. "Tie him up," Jaxx growled, stepping back from the ledge. His brothers produced a set of heavy-duty zip ties and secured Gideon's hands and feet, pulling them tight enough to cut off circulation. They did the same to the other 2 thugs, who had been quickly rounded up by the perimeter team after a brief and one-sided struggle. They left the 3 men trussed up in the middle of the living room, a pathetic tableau of defeated evil. Jaxx took out his satellite phone and dialed a number for a state trooper he knew, a man named Miller who owed him a favor. "Trooper Miller," Jaxx said, his voice disguised with a low rasp. "I've got an anonymous tip for you. The residents of one Gideon Croft, about 60 miles north of Ely off 93. You might want to check on the welfare of his associates, and you'll find Mr. Croft himself tied up and waiting for you. Tell your bosses the Hells Angels send their regards." He hung up before Miller could reply. They faded back into the night as silently as they had come, leaving the wreckage of Gideon's little empire for the law to clean up. They had been ghosts, a storm that passed through and left behind a stark and undeniable form of justice. At the safe house, a rustic, secluded cabin deep in the mountains owned by the club, Serena finally allowed herself to break. The sobs came in great, heaving waves, a tsunami of released fear, pain, and overwhelming relief. The bikers gave her space. They were not men comfortable with tears, but they understood them. They built a fire in the hearth, and one of them, a burly man named Bear, quietly placed a steaming mug of tea and a thick wool blanket beside her. There were no platitudes, no empty assurances that everything would be okay. There was just a quiet, respectful presence. Later, when the tears had subsided, Jaxx sat in a chair across from her. The firelight flickered on his face, softening the hard lines and illuminating the sadness in his own eyes. "He can't hurt you anymore," Jaxx said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't know how I can ever—" "You don't have to," he cut her off gently. "We have a code. We don't like bullies. We don't like men who hurt women." He stared into the flames for a long moment, the memories churning behind his eyes. "I had a sister," he said, the words costing him more than any physical blow ever could. "Her husband, he was like Gideon, full of smiles for the world and full of poison for her. I was just a prospect back then. I didn't see it until it was too late. By the time the club was ready to step in, she was gone." He looked at Serena, his gaze direct and filled with a profound, shared understanding of loss and survival. "We were too late for her. We weren't too late for you." While they talked, Rook was on the phone, his voice a low, insistent rumble. He was pulling strings, calling in favors, navigating the bureaucratic maze to find Cody. After an hour, he came back into the cabin, a rare smile on his face. "He's safe," Rook announced. The attendant did his job. "Cody's at the county sheriff's office over in White Pine. They've got him with a social worker. He's okay, Serena. He's asking for you." The next morning, Jaxx and Rook drove Serena to the county seat in a nondescript SUV the club kept for such occasions. The reunion was explosive. The moment Cody saw his mother walk through the door, he let out a cry and launched himself into her arms. They clung to each other, a tiny island of love and relief in a sea of sterile government offices. Jaxx and Rook watched from the doorway, two leather-clad guardians, their job complete. They slipped out before any officials could ask too many questions, their anonymity their shield. As they walked out into the bright morning sun, Rook clapped Jaxx on the shoulder. "That right there, Perez," he said, nodding back toward the building. "That's why we do this." Jaxx nodded, a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying for 2 decades finally lifting from his soul. He hadn't been able to save Sarah, but today he had saved Serena. And for the first time in a long time, the ghosts of the past felt a little further away. Weeks melted into a month. Life for Serena and Cody was a quiet process of rebuilding. The club, through a series of anonymous donations and third-party contacts, had set them up in a small, clean apartment in a town hundreds of miles away from Nevada. It was a place with green trees and quiet streets, a world away from the dust and terror of their old life. Serena found a job at a local library, the silence and the endless rows of stories of balm to her frayed nerves. She started therapy, learning to untangle the knots of fear and guilt that Gideon had so expertly tied. She watched Cody play in the park, his laughter no longer strained, his eyes free of a shadow that had haunted them for so long. One afternoon, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw not the shattered woman from the trailer, but a survivor. Her eyes were clear, her jaw was set. There were scars, yes, but they were a map of where she had been, not a cage to keep her in. Back at the clubhouse, Life had returned to its normal rhythm of chrome polish, engine grease, and the low rumble of Brotherhood. The rescue of Serena Hayes had become another chapter in the club's unwritten history, a story told in low voices over beers. It had reaffirmed their purpose. They were outlaws, society's bogeymen, but they lived by a code stricter than any law written on paper. They protected their own, and they protected those the system had failed. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the club's post office box. It had no return address, but Jaxx recognized the neat, careful handwriting on the envelope. He opened it in the privacy of his own room. Inside was a simple, heartfelt thank you note from Serena. Tucked inside the folded paper was a child's drawing, done in bright crayon colors. It depicted a smiling woman and a small boy holding hands. Next to them stood a very large man with tattooed arms, standing beside a magnificent motorcycle. Underneath the drawing, in a child's shaky printing, were the words, "M.Y. Mom's Angel." Jaxx stared at the drawing for a long time. He carefully folded it and tucked it into the inside pocket of his leather cut, the one right over his heart. He felt the crinkle of the paper against his chest as he walked out into the yard and swung his leg over his Harley. He fired up the engine, the sound a deep, soul-shaking roar. It was the sound of a promise kept, of a debt paid, of a ghost finally laid to rest. He pulled out onto the open road, the wind at his back, a lone rider against the vast horizon. They are the guardians on the edge of society, the last line of defense for the forgotten. If you believe in the power of a brotherhood that stands for justice, share this story. Let the world know that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather. Comment below with your thoughts on these modern-day nights, and subscribe for more tales of impossible rescues. And if you or someone you know is in trouble, never, ever give up hope.